Hello and welcome to a very exciting episode of Mysteries of Science. I'm Stevie, Assistant Editor of Science+Nature, the monthly magazine from the team behind The Week Junior.
And I'm Dan, the editor. If you're new to the podcast, welcome. In each episode, we dive deep into one of my favourite parts of the magazine, Mysteries of Science. We look at the stories that have left scientists scratching their heads and, despite their best attempts, remain well and truly unsolved.
So this episode, we're going to try and cover the truth behind one of my all-time favourite mysteries, Sutton Hoo, which is home to one of Europe's biggest archaeological finds, and the story has a supernatural twist. Dan, can you tell us who or what is Sutton Hoo?
So just outside the town of Woodbridge in Suffolk, that's in the east of England, there lies this field with many mysterious mounds. And in the early 19th century, nobody knew exactly how old these mounds were, and people were wondering what might be buried inside them.
The place is full of mysteries. When they excavated the mounds in the early 20th century, a huge treasure trove was found hidden inside the remains of a whole ship. There were gold coins, jewellery, weapons, an amazing helmet and a sceptre. These priceless artefacts were buried in what looked like a grave and must have belonged to a really important person, but there was no sign of a person inside and no skeleton has ever been found.
And the mysteries get even deeper. The person who dug up the mounds was led to the correct place by spooky visions of ancient warrior ghosts.
That's crazy. So we've got ghosts, we've got ancient warriors and a buried ship filled with treasure. This mystery literally has everything. To help us unlock the truth behind this ghastly tale, we have real-life archaeologists whose job it is to dig up and understand the past. They will help us explain what's going on under these mysterious mounds.
Yeah, let's shut our eyes tight and blunder headfirst into this supernatural story and find out how scientific advances have helped us unearth Sutton Hoo's secrets. This is Mysteries of Science.
Let's rewind to 1926. Tranmere House, a big house in Woodbridge, has just been bought by Frank Pretty and his wife Edith. 9 years later, Frank dies, leaving Edith alone in the house with her 4-year-old son. Mrs. Pretty became interested in spiritualism. That is the belief that people can communicate with the dead. She turns her attentions towards the curious burial mounds on her estate.
A burial mound is a man-made hill of earth and stones which is built over the remains of the dead.
So the story continues that with the help of an archaeologist friend called Basil Brown and those spooky visions of ghost warriors we mentioned earlier, they found one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of all time. Let's dig a little deeper into this mystery.
My name's Angus Wainwright. I'm the National Trust's archaeologist for the East of England region.
Angus has a very special job at the National Trust, and he helps people take care of archaeological sites so they don't get damaged. And he told us more about what lies beneath Sutton Hoo's mysterious mounds.
Well, when you visit the site is made up of a few grassy mounds, which, many people are a bit disappointed by because, they don't look all that spectacular. But actually, it's, of course, what was underneath them, which was spectacular and interesting and, led to the writing of many books and hundreds of academic papers. These are burial mounds gathered together and they date from around 600 AD, so they're Anglo-Saxon and they belong to the pagan period of Anglo-Saxon history. Of course, the contents of them was very spectacular.
The Anglo-Saxons were people who arrived in Britain after the Romans from around 420 AD and ruled much of England until William the Conqueror came along in 1066.
Yeah, and they often buried their dead with objects that they believed that might help them in their afterlives. But there's one big problem, right, with burying your best treasure in the grave, as Angus explained to us.
Unfortunately, most of them were robbed, so we actually only have 2 undisturbed mounds, and one of them is the famous ship burial, which most people will be familiar with, the fabulous treasures which came out of that. But the other mounds probably contained, at least some of them, similar riches, but unfortunately they were robbed.
So when Edith and Basil dug up the mounds, what did they find? We talked to Laura, the archaeology engagement manager at Sutton Hoo. and she explained how Edith Pretty and Basil Brown struck gold.
So 1938, Basil excavates 3 of the burial mounds, what we refer to now as mounds 2, 3 and 4, funnily enough, and each of these mounds had kind of tantalising fragments. Each of them had been robbed by people many years previous, but each of them had these kind of tantalising fragments of the former riches. So Mound 2, for instance, is Sutton Hoo's other ship burial, and the rivets were heavily displaced by both the kind of robbing and rabbits as well. So none of the rivets were where they were supposed to be. It was a huge kind of scatter diagram of rivets everywhere. I think... Yeah, but that was kind of enough. The events of 1938 were enough to warrant coming back in 1939, and that 1939 is really where they hit the jackpot.
Wow, so there's just nothing left of this ship?
So no, just the rivets. These are iron pins which hold the thing together. These are all that was left behind when the wood of the ship rotted away, and would have been enough to convince Edith and Basil to keep digging up the mounds.
So I'm just going to fast forward a little bit to 1939, and Basil Brown starts work again in the summer of 1939, and this is Sutton Hoo's other ship burial, and as I said, the jackpot, which had, you know, in amongst it the iconic Sutton Hoo helmet and other things, and he would have found the rivets, and unlike Mound 2, the rivets were where they were supposed to be. So what he did was kind of uncover the fossil of a ship. When you look at photographs from Sutton Hoo, a lot of visitors come today expecting to see a ship, but we have very acidic soil in Suffolk, which meant that all of the organic material, such as the timbers of the ship, rotted away over time. So what you see in those fantastic photographs is the fossil of a ship peppered with these rusty iron rivets. So he set about very carefully, and you're looking at very subtle differentiations in the kind of colour and the texture of the soil, very carefully uncovered the fossil of this ship. Now that was notable in itself. As I said before, there are only 3 Anglo-Saxon ship burials known of in the whole of England. So that was enough to kind of pique the kind of archaeological community's interest. But then add on top of that an undisturbed burial chamber in the middle. I mean, this was, you know, something that none of the people who kind of instigated this dig or involved with could have dreamt of in their wildest kind of dreams, that they were going to be part of this fantastic experience.
Wow, this is truly an exceptional find and a wonderful archaeological story. But what I'm really interested in is the ghost story and why Edith wanted to dig up the mounds.
Oh, I do love a good ghost story as well. And legend has it that when her husband Frank died, Edith Pretty became interested in spiritualism, which was, let's say, it was the 1930s, it was quite popular at the time. And basically, some people believed that there is this spirit realm where the dead live, and you know, if you do things right and you do all the rituals, you can speak to them, you can contact them in their realm and speak to them. And she had a spiritualist friend called Dorothy Cox who visited the estate, and she said she saw these ghostly Anglo-Saxon warriors marching around one of the mounds. And Edith herself claimed to have had dreams about helmeted warriors who were being buried with lots of golden objects.
Oh, this is more like it. Ghostly soldiers and buried warriors. But I wonder what the science behind all of this is.
Yes, it's not sounding very scientific, is it, Stevie? Let's hear from Laura, shall we?
Yeah, I think Mrs. Pretty, so Edith Pretty was the landowner, a really interesting character. She's quite... lots of different people were involved with the investigations at Sutton Hoo, and I think Mrs. Pretty is sometimes the one where it's quite hard to kind of find her voice in a way, because a lot of the other people involved, such as Basil Brown, the archaeologist, left a diary, so we actually know in his words what he thought about various things, what he did, whereas for kind of the archaeological investigations themselves, we don't have a lot of kind of first-hand documentary evidence, so it's sometimes, you know, trying not to put words in people's mouths. What we do know, though, about Mrs. Pretty was that she was interested in archaeology from a very young age. There'd been some excavations at her family home up in Cheshire that her father had kind of commissioned. A Cistercian abbey was kind of found there at Vale Royal. She also was very well travelled. She'd been and seen excavations in Egypt. She'd been more or less to kind of every continent across the globe.
So that's one mystery cleared up. It seems that Mrs. Pretty had an archaeological background. The experts also don't seem to believe in ghost stories.
But there are loads more mysteries to uncover.
Great. Yes, there's one thing that's been puzzling me for a while, and that is the ship burial. It sounds like it must have been someone pretty important if they buried a whole ship filled with treasure.
So if we can kind of imagine, the Sutton Hoo Mound 1 ship is 27 metres long. So of all of the Anglo-Saxon ship burials, which, as I've said, there are only 3. It's the biggest of the lot, and it had space for 40 oarsmen. And if you come to the National Trust Sutton Hoo site, we do have a full-size sculptural representation of the ship in the courtyard to really get people to grips with the scale. So this ship, we believe, was hauled up from the river and placed in this kind of burial mound, and then a structure was constructed in the middle of the ship, this burial chamber, and the person who had passed away was laid out with lots of love and care and attention, and objects which they would need to accompany them, and then earth was heaped on top of that in order to create the burial mound itself.
Whoa, I don't even know how you would go about moving a huge ship like that. So who was the mysterious person, do we think?
This is definitely somebody from a royal kind of circle, somebody very important. And each of the objects placed in there tells a different story about who this person was. We don't definitely know who the person was that was buried in there. We, have some likely candidate of who the person was.
Although we may never know who was buried at Sutton Hoo, some historians believe that it was a local king called Riedwald of East Anglia. I hope that's right. My grasp of Old English or Anglo-Saxon is not the best.
One of the problems of Sutton Hoo, or, its great benefit is that it's rather unique in Anglo-Saxon cemeteries in that it's an elite cemetery. It only really has very important people in it. And we think these are the pagan royal family of the Kingdom of East Anglia.
Yeah, each of the objects tells us something about them. So we know that they were a fierce and kind of proud warrior by some of the weaponry included. They had good trading connections, some of the objects coming from many, many miles away. Some of the garnets used in some of the artwork might have come from as far away as Sri Lanka, things from Syria, Scandinavia. We know that they're a feast giver as well, and so there's lots of kind of feasting equipment in there. They took great pride in their personal appearance. They could commission these kind of luxury, unique objects. So each object placed in there tells a story.
So it's time for a recap now. We have the several burial mounds, one of which contained a huge ship filled with buried treasure, which may or may not have been the grave of an East Anglian king. But no skeleton has ever been found, so we can't be sure. Is that right?
Yeah, this is truly the mystery that just keeps on giving. And then, on top of that, there's the treasure. What sort of artefacts did they find in there, do you know?
Well, there was the really famous helmet, which was actually found in thousands of bits and painstakingly pieced together by archaeologists. All of these amazing artefacts can now be found in the British Museum. If you head over there to britishmuseum.org, you can actually take a virtual tour of all of the artefacts right now and have a look at them. So Angus told us about a few of his favourite artefacts and also a few strange ones which didn't seem like they should be there.
So two are slightly peculiar and mysterious. One is a tiny little bronze bell which came out of Mound 1, and we don't really understand what that was doing, what it was for. And there's also a strange iron spanner shaped object. What on earth was that for? But really my big one would be what's sometimes called the sceptre, which is a fabulous object. It's a great big whetstone, tapered at each end with heads carved in the hard stone at either end, and attached to it at either end is some metalwork, one having a big ring with a bronze stag on it. Now, this has been interpreted in all kinds of different ways, and no, it doesn't have any parallels in Europe or in Britain. So I think it sort of stands in my mind for the kind of mysteries of archaeology that we can have, we can always understand a certain amount about the past, but there's often things which are entirely mysterious and sort of beyond our grasp.
A sceptre is a long staff or wand that has usually been held by someone royal.
And a whetstone is a tool used to sharpen blades. Laura, can you tell us how these discoveries have helped people find out more about the period?
Sometimes the Anglo-Saxon period, I think, for a lot of people feels quite unfamiliar. So, we're quite kind of happy with the concept of who the Romans were, for instance, that came beforehand. But for a lot of people, it's like, who are these people? Really, I think it had been a period of time that had been referred to as the Dark Ages, and Sutton Hoo really kind of shone a light on this period and illuminated it to show, that this wasn't a dark, backwards time. This was a time of much kind of cultural richness and sophistication.
So these mysterious mounds not only told us secrets about the people buried inside, but also about the Anglo-Saxon people themselves. We now know that Anglo-Saxons were much more advanced than first thought.
Yeah, it's incredible. And the story of Sutton Hoo doesn't even end there, because with more and more scientific advances, that's opening up the site, and there's even more and more to find. It's a complete treasure trove. And Angus believes there's much more to discover in the future.
So there's all sorts of things we can do nowadays that they couldn't do back then. So if we're looking at the objects, which are all in the British Museum, there are all kinds of analyses that can take place on those objects, which will reveal more about them. On the site itself, many of the mounds haven't been excavated. We're not considering more excavation, but one thing we are going to do is more geophysics on the mounds, which will give us more of an idea about how many mounds there really were, because believe it or not, we don't really know that, and we're not even really sure about the extent of the cemetery, and that geophysics will also maybe reveal more about what happened before and after Sutton Hoo.
So geophysics is just a whole suite of techniques that you can use to find out what's beneath the ground.
Yes, that's really exciting. The discovery of Sutton Hoo was one of the biggest finds of the 20th century in the UK, and it has even been compared to the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb.
Sutton Hoo was referred to in 1939, when the discoveries took place, as England's own kind of Valley of the Kings, and I think that kind of puts across, it's kind of considered on a par with kind of Tutankhamun, that kind of thing as well. There have been really notable archaeological discoveries in the world of Anglo-Saxon since. So the Pritterwell Prince, which is a burial in Essex, which was discovered in 2003, and the Staffordshire Hoard in 2009. And both of those are fantastic and amazing discoveries. But for me, Sutton Hoo does stand proud as kind of as a royal burial on the kind of the scale that it is, the luxuriousness of the burials as well. I think, Sutton Hoo is definitely, it would take something to beat it, I think.
Right, we've heard from the experts, but now it's time for everyone listening to have your say. What other secrets do you think could be hiding in the mounds, and who are the ghosts protecting them?
We want to hear from you. Email hello@science-nature.co.uk to tell us what you think, either by writing in an email, or you can record your thoughts on a phone, or make a short video and send it in to us.
We'll include some of your emails in a future episode of Mysteries of Science, so make sure you get involved. Remember to pick up the latest copy of the Week Junior Science and Nature for even more mysteries.
And we'll be back in 2 weeks with our next mystery. It's time to head into the world of the multiverse. We'll be looking into this mind-boggling theory that there is more than just one universe out there, possibly an infinite amount, and we'll be bringing, as usual, top experts in to help. Until then,
stay curious.
If you want to get your hands on a copy of the Week Junior magazine, we're offering a 6-week free trial. To get yours, head over to dennismags.co.uk/The Week Junior and use the code PODCAST.